Medicaid and alternatives to Medicaid in long-term care planning. So before I start too much in today's topic, just know that if you have any questions as we go through, there is a question and answer feature available for those who are attending the webinar live. So I'd love your questions as we go through. You can put that right in that question and answer feature, and I will just answer them as we go. So no need to wait for the end or anything like that. At the end of today's webinar, you're going to get a copy of feedback form for how you thought the presentation went. A couple of things with that. One is I'd love your comments. See what you know about the webinar, maybe any other webinars that you'd like to see in the future as we kind of start to think about the new year. As well as with our office, we do offer 2-hour complimentary initial consultations where you can meet with an attorney from our office to specifically talk about your estate plan, your goals, any questions that you have. It is that full 2 hours, so there's no cost to that, but that allows us to get to know you and your family, understand what you're hoping to do, make a recommendation, and then we would quote any fee associated with that planning, hopefully at that time. So if you would like us to reach out to you to get that scheduled, there's an opportunity to do that again, same in that feedback form. And otherwise, our kind of topic today, again, Medicaid and alternatives to Medicaid and long-term care planning. Firstly, I wanted to just talk about some of the levels of care, and this is a handout that you'll receive. Just identifying what are different types of care, what are those associated costs, because if we're looking to plan around the cost of something, it is helpful to kind of know what are those costs. So these aren't like national averages or anything, but if someone is looking to receive care at home, so that would mean most commonly that they're paying someone like a professional caregiver, someone to come into their home maybe for a couple hours a week. That could by far be your most expensive type of planning or most expensive type of care, if you need like 24/7 round the clock care at home. What's nice about care at home, obviously, is that you're at home as long as that home can be easily accommodating for what you might need as you age. How many stairs are there? Does it need to be made more accessible? Is it safe? So are there like good options for like transferring related to like personal hygiene? All those things you need to keep in mind if you're trying to receive at-home care. But normally what we're seeing in terms of cost for at-home care is about $32 an hour to $35 an hour for at-home care, which if you need just a couple hours a week, can be a cost that you can plan for in relation to your income. Otherwise, if it starts to be that you need a lot of care or that care is very expensive because of the level of care that you need, that may be where someone starts to look more at a facility. So typically with our clients, we do find that there's a transition from like living in the home to what's called assisted living. So an ALF or ALH, depending on the acronym someone uses. But that assisted living is where there's some level of skilled nursing, but it's limited in terms of the hours that's provided. There are other options beyond just like at home before you'd receive that assisted living side. That could be like senior housing, or there's adult family housing. What these things are more where you're living like an RCACs or in an apartment, or maybe some type of like shared housing, a semi-home environment. You're paying rent or something to be able to live there. You can have, people more nearby for if you have needs. And a lot of times families will bring in certain services. So they may coordinate to receive a certain amount of care at that particular, senior housing or that residential care apartment complexes, which are commonly referred to as RCACs. What's convenient about those is having everything kind of near you as you access those services. They're often less expensive than the true assisted livings, just because what you're typically paying for is like, again, the monthly rent or utilities or things like that. You're not necessarily paying for care services with that expense alone, but it is likely an additional expense to bring care in. So as we start to transition into that like assisted living sides of things, that's where, again, there's some, some access to nursing hours, there's limitations on how much care can be provided there. But most people do tend to transition from like home into an assisted living. So we're seeing that probably on the lower end with like some access to care at like $4,500 a month. So that's $4,500 a month for most assisted livings. Those housing options before that can be a little bit less expensive, can be more expensive if you're receiving care. Probably one of the most expensive things compared to that would be like skilled nursing. So if you needed 24/7 skilled nursing care, that's kind of one of the highest levels of nursing care. 24/7, there typically is like a daily rate or a monthly rate, but we're already seeing that exceed more of that $10,000 to $12,000 a month. I've seen that certainly be more. Where memory care kind of comes in between that assisted living and skilled nursing is typically it's a higher level of assisted living. So you're kind of between the skilled nursing and assisted livings. That's about $6,000, $8,000 a month. And then typically that nursing home is the most expensive, unless you are getting 24/7 at home care. And that typically outcosts even a skilled nursing facility on that end. So how do we pay for that? How do we pay for all those care costs? First of all, it matters just what your income is. If you have enough income to sustain those costs, then we're not as concerned. So let's say, for example, that, you're a single individual, you have like $3,000 a month in income, just Social Security, maybe some RMDs, and you just want to bring in care, or a loved one wants to bring in care for a couple hours a week. It is important that you treat that caregiver in a very kind of formal employee way. You want to be careful about not paying family members or doing that by having a notarized caregiver agreement prior. But again, if your income is sufficient to cover that care costs, that's great, because that means that your income alone is paying for those things. The next thing that we probably look at, if income alone wasn't enough, well, what do your assets look like? Bill Gates is not worried about paying for care. If we just ignore his income and focus on what he probably has in assets, he could build a skilled nursing facility if he'd probably like to. So if your assets alone mean that even when you have that, shortfall or that difference in income, that, we're not concerned about the ability to support you because you could live for 40 more years and access care at that level, then that's a great position to be in. So it's again, firstly, your income, but otherwise, what do your assets look like? What are those assets comprised of? Because it can be better to spend certain types of monies first because of like income tax deductions. Otherwise, long-term care insurance. So I don't sell long-term care insurance. I have seen where it can be really helpful for clients in terms of maintaining some choice and quality and control over the quality of care that they receive. What's nice about long-term care insurance is that it can help to become that income stream in the event of care. So if you don't already have long-term care insurance, it is a great thing to look into in terms of helping to pay for care. There was some problems with like the actuarial tables that they did many years ago now, I think at least 10, if not 15 years ago. Essentially, when long-term care insurance was starting, there was some, miscalculations, I guess I'll say, related to, well, how long do people live? How long are people going to receive care? So the number of, companies that sell these things has kind of gone down in terms of who offers it. If you have long-term care insurance, it's a great thing to maintain, especially if you have like what I refer to as like a Cadillac policy. So if it's something that pays indefinitely for any amount of money, you definitely want to maintain that because you're not going to find that coverage anymore. If you don't have long-term care insurance, it's a great thing to ask your advisor about. Typically what I tell my clients is if you're over 65, it can start to become cost prohibitive. So just know, typically if you're over 65, it can be too expensive. Obviously you can't eat your insurance, so it's always a decision. But if you're worried about care costs, it can be one of the easiest things in terms of that income replacement. So that way you may not have to look at something like Medicaid, or at least not consider that for a longer time. Because ultimately what long-term care insurance does is, they'll pay you to pay for your care. What you'd want is probably a policy that covers at least 3 to 5 years. The reason being that lots of facilities have private pay requirements. So that long-term care insurance can be a great option in terms of showing that you have the ability to pay privately for that amount of time. You definitely probably want something that goes up with inflation, because as we're seeing, care costs are just getting more expensive. I mean, care is more expensive because it feels like everything's just more expensive. We have a shortage of healthcare workers. So that can mean that, there's increased wages and other things. We know how important they are. And we also just have an aging population, which means that, care costs are not going to go down. So long-term care insurance is a great thing to look into. There are hybrid policies that sometimes are nice. I have clients that are worried about, paying all this money when they don't get that benefit, which is kind of the point of insurance. But also there are unique things with hybrid life insurance, long-term care insurance that are very interesting. So talk with your advisors, insurance or financial, about long-term care insurance if you're interested. By far the best thing is just to get a quote based on your age, your health insurance, and if you can only insure you or only insure a spouse, at least that can help with some of these things. Long-term care insurance is a great alternative to looking at Medicaid. That's not to say that it's the only thing that someone wants to do. It depends again on how long that policy pays, or if there's other planning to do in the meantime. It's really helpful for that. I've seen it make a big difference for families. Any questions so far on costs of care, long-term care insurance, things like that? Again, just know that there is that question and answer feature, and I'm happy to talk about those things. Otherwise, beyond long-term care insurance, there are typically, there's Medicaid, which we'll talk about. But there is also the VA. So for wartime veterans or the surviving spouses of wartime veterans, the VA will, it's a pension benefit called the improved pension benefit or other things. I'm just going to pause because I see a question. Can you elaborate on what you mean by having more control when you have long-term care? I'm assuming that means when you have long-term care insurance. Okay. So what long-term care insurance is again, it's a policy that would help to pay income as soon as you have care needs. One of the things that I love about long-term care insurance is that it's kind of like giving families permission to spend money on their care. Especially in a spousal situation, or if it's your wish to be at home, having money that you can turn on when you need care and care at home can actually allow you to get care earlier to help maintain your quality of life. So if you have that long-term care insurance, it's permission for you or for your family, if they're helping you, to start to spend money on care. And that can be what keeps you at home or keeps you more comfortable. And if you're that spouse providing care at home for someone, it can allow you to remain that much more a spouse rather than a caregiver, or maybe alleviate some hours in the week for that spouse who's that caregiver to take care of themselves and have permission to do that, because you're less worried about where that money for care is coming from. It's one of the reasons why it can be so helpful for families. The other thing is that when someone needs to go into care, sometimes they engage in other types of planning. So that may mean protecting assets in a type of trust that doesn't make it have to be spent down on care or protects it from that recovery. And essentially, when we're doing that planning, it's just math. It matters that your power of attorney can do some of these techniques and things. So it's important to have good powers of attorney. But where long-term care insurance and other long-term care planning work really well together is that it can allow you to have like more time to, like, say, take some tax withdrawals from IRAs. It can allow you more time to shift things over and to do other planning or to lapse like a penalty. Ultimately, it affords you more choice in some of the long-term care planning that you like to do, because sometimes when we're doing long-term care planning, there can be a very clear path just because, you know, if someone's purely out of funds, we have no choice but to pursue Medicaid. You know, at least we can help with that. But sometimes long-term care insurance can afford you a little bit more flexibility in waiting for that planning, or being able to choose a little bit more in what you protect at that time, because we're making up some of that income loss through that insurance. So permission to spend, you know, spend your money on you or you and your spouse, the things that you need, take care of yourselves, allow your family to take care of you, have that permission to access services either at home or maybe in a, you know, senior housing where you can start to feel safer and your family feels that you're safer. But in addition, just more flexibility in terms of sometimes the other planning that we could do. I mean, if your long-term care insurance is enough to pay for all the care that you'll need, well, then we don't ever have to worry about Medicaid in that sense. And if we do, then we have a much more longer timeline where we can sort through taxes and all those kind of good things. So I hope that answers your question. Again, that's kind of the reasons why long-term care insurance is very helpful. But I do recognize that it's not always an option for folks. It depends on obviously what you can afford. Can't eat your insurance, just a little bit of a joke. But it's always a good thing to look into and get a quote. So otherwise, for veterans, there are some additional options for paying for care for veterans, wartime veterans. So these are defined periods of war. You can actually find these like right on our website. So if you go to hooperlawoffice.com, we have right away that options for veterans. And then if you go in there, you'll see not only the like max pension amounts that someone could receive, but those defined periods of war. So check out those defined periods of war if you or a family member served. And again, this is a benefit available for surviving spouses of wartime veterans. So someone needs to have served at least 90 days active duty. Only one of those days needs to have been in that defined period of war. So for example, if you entered your service on May 7th, 1975, if you entered your service on that date and you served, a year or 2 years, so well over the 90 days active duty, you would still be considered a Vietnam War veteran. Unfortunately, we are kind of in a gap. I have lots of clients who served between like Korea and Vietnam. It does need to at least be one date within that wartime period, active duty. So nothing purely reserves or nothing purely training, have to have been activated within that time period. And then as far as the discharge, you need to receive anything other than a discharge under a dishonorable conditions. So just think of that as like a dishonorable discharge. It was a little bit more technical than that, but what you can find if you're not sure on some of those dates or those requirements, track down what's called like DD-214 paperwork. It's discharge paperwork for that veteran. So the good news is that I've been told by veterans that when they left their service, they were given this paperwork and they were told, this is very important. Do not lose this paperwork. You need to keep good track of this paperwork. That was very clear. So they probably have it. It's probably somewhere. I will tell you from personal experience that we found my grandpa's in a safety deposit box. It's very common that some of those important papers are kept in a safety deposit box or a safe. What you want to find are those DD-214s to see if it's a benefit that person could potentially qualify for. Again, wartime veterans, surviving spouses of wartime veterans. Those dates matter, those GD 214s matter. And then there are also income and asset requirements. Just comparing the VA to Medicaid, what's nice about the VA is as a single person, you're allowed to have a lot more. It's not quite this, it's similar in terms of what married couples can have, but there's no like distinction for the retirement accounts. So definitely as a single person, you can have more assets than you can have on Medicaid. There's no sort of a state recovery component with that VA aid and attendance or improved pension program. So that's nice too. The only catch, I would say, with the VA or those who are considering, do we pursue the VA or do we pursue Medicaid? First of all, we always probably try to plan for both because your needs may change. Like all of our Veterans Trust are compliant for Medicaid as well. What you want to be cognizant of is that the VA only pays so much. So if you're able to get that maximum pension benefit, which again, you can see those right in our office, you'll see that like options for veterans, it goes through those defined wartime periods. And for example, if you were a surviving spouse of a wartime veteran, your maximum pension benefit for 2023, and we do have the 2024 numbers. They're not up yet on our website because it's still December. But that's the $1,432 a month that person could receive as that pension benefit. But that is the most the VA will pay. So if we were to add to someone's already gross income, that $1,432 a month, and it's enough or at least a shortfall that we're more comfortable with, then we don't have to be as worried about Medicaid right now. But if someone's care needs change, or if that pension benefit combined with their income is still not sufficient for those care costs, it may mean that we look more at Medicaid. Again, we can always plan for both, but that is the kind of difference between like how much the VA would pay versus how much Medicaid would pay. Because Medicaid is just largely like a cost equalizer. That they'll just kind of take all your income and pay for care. And I guess there's some distinctions there on married couples. But they'll just pay the difference. The VA pays a certain max amount. So, and they have, again, asset and income requirements. But what's most important is that you find that DD 214, see if it's something that, would seem to qualify. And then all of our attorneys are actually VA accredited. So what that means is that in order to help families with this benefit, attorneys have to be accredited by the VA. So again, all of our attorneys are accredited by the VA. Love to help veterans and their families plan for these benefits. If you have any questions on those qualifications, you can certainly schedule a time to discuss it. And it's a great option for paying for care, not always sufficient depending on how those income and asset things are looking. So otherwise, we haven't really talked about Medicaid too much, more the alternatives, just because there's so many times that we do touch on what Medicaid is, and I wanted to focus a little bit more about some of the other options that someone has. The reason being that Medicaid has functional asset income requirements. The big things that people need to be aware of is like how much you can have and access Medicaid. How Medicaid looks at gifts and other divestments, and the estate recovery component that comes with Medicaid, different from anything else we've talked about so far. So with Medicaid, it doesn't matter if someone is single or married, largely in terms of what they're allowed to have. So for a married couple, you can have a home, and we're not as worried about a lien being placed against that home if the spouse who's on Medicaid passes first. So there's a little bit of a caveat to the home, but the home is non-countable. You can have some money set aside for each spouse, and in fact, even some of the kids as far as burial expenses. So that's something we could look at. You can have less than $1,500 face value life insurance. So just note, term doesn't typically have that cash value then, because if you have more than that face value, they look at the cash value, but they don't allocate anything to the premiums, then it is potentially recoverable. So lots of caveats with the life insurance. And then you can have one car. That's not one car per spouse. That's just one car for a couple. And then the important part is the retirement accounts of that spouse who's at home. They're referred to as the community spouse. Those don't have to be spent on care. They're non-countable. So otherwise, everything else has to be spent below a certain amount. So if the countable things are less than $50,000, that community spouse gets to keep everything. The most that the community spouse gets to keep is about this year $148,000. But if you had $200,000 in countable assets, you would still have to spend down to half, which is the $100,000. The most that half can be, or the cap on that half, if you think about it, is that $148,000. So if it was $200,000 in countable assets, it's still half, up to, again, the maximum of that half being $148,000. So when people are talking about spend down, and I know we talked about this just a couple of weeks ago at the webinar, that's what they're talking about, is trying to qualify for the asset component of Medicaid. For a single person, very different. Obviously, the things that are still the same are like the house. The concern with the house definitely becomes that lien, because if someone is on Medicaid as a single person, they can have the house. They don't give you any money to maintain the house. You can have the house. There is a lien that is placed against that house then when you pass, up to the value of whatever is paid out in benefits. You can have the burial. You can have that life insurance. You can have that vehicle. There is no exception then for the retirement accounts. So everything else for that single person, all the countable things, including their retirement, has to be spent below $2,000. So there is a big shift between single people and married people on Medicaid. And in addition to those what's countable, there is an estate recovery concern, because when the state through Medicaid pays for those care benefits, essentially whatever they're actually paying out in benefits is, recoverable in certain things. And, we do have expanded estate recovery. We have since August 1st of 2014. So sometimes people have previous planning. It is important to know what is recoverable, or some of the options there. Just because I only have a couple of minutes left, I want to hit on some big picture things. Do not gift your home to your kids to try to avoid Medicaid. It is a huge loss of control. It is bad tax planning. So we have like handouts and stuff that we can provide as far as why you shouldn't just gift your house to your kids to try to avoid Medicaid. Again, there are lots of alternatives to Medicaid. It's not a good idea. There are hardly ever absolutes, but that's probably one of them. Life estate deeds. Very, very common. Used to be very, very common. We didn't really like them a ton for a couple of different reasons, but do know that life estate deeds do not protect from estate recovery anymore. And that is of August 1st, 2014. So life estates means that mom and dad basically would have a life estate. So the kids would have what's called a remainderment interest in the home. As mom and dad age, their share will go down, although honestly, it barely goes down. And then, kids' interest would proportionally increase. Mom and dad's interest, if they access Medicaid as of August 1st, 2014, is recoverable. So that's one of the reasons why we do not like life estate deeds. So if you have one of those, it's important to get it reviewed, see what otherwise your options are. Let's see. Don't give the house to kids. Be aware of life estate deeds. Oh, and powers of attorney. So if you're trying to help a parent with this, or you're concerned about a loved one, especially as you go home for the holidays, and maybe you're starting to notice a difference, or maybe a loved one has a diagnosis, or your spouse has a diagnosis, and you're just really not sure what to do with, planning for long-term care, either prospective or emergency, what is absolutely necessary are good powers of attorney, good financial powers of attorney in particular. Because all of these things we talked about, all of the financial planning under the sun, If you don't have someone who can do that, someone who's not authorized, and then we're trying to go through guardianship or other things, and I know we just talked about guardianship recently, makes this all very difficult. So it is still better to look at some of this in advance, have good powers of attorney, understand that there are options of paying for care beyond just Medicaid. But if Medicaid is what someone is pursuing, there are important things to be aware of as far as how that works for the assets, how that works for someone's income. And again, there are estate recovery components of accessing a benefit like that. So next week, we're actually having our Wills versus Trust seminar at the DJ Bordini Center right here in Appleton by the Tech, Fox Valley Tech. Would recommend registering for that. You can do that right on our website. There is a 2 o'clock and a 6 o'clock. We actually talk more about wills, powers of attorney, different type of planning, such as like those revocable or irrevocable trusts, wills in general. So it's a great thing to attend if you're kind of just getting familiar with estate planning. It's a really wonderful seminar. Again, that's next week. You can register right on our website. That's our Wills versus Trust seminar, 2 o'clock and 6 o'clock next Wednesday. Otherwise, we're taking a little bit of a break on the webinars just for the holidays. And then we'll get started back in 2024. So again, feedback forms will be sent to you. If you have any feedback, there's that handout. Otherwise, really hope to see you at our future events. And if there's ever anything that you want to talk about in particular, we're more than open to take recommendations like for the webinars and other things. So thank you so much for your time. I'll let everyone go. Happy holidays.